Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce the team who will be presenting next. So we have Angela Duckworth, who is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and Eli Tsukayama, who's a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and they'll be talking about domain specificity and self-control. So please help me welcome Eli and Angela.
So thanks so much. I don't want you to get the impression from my standing up here for the majority of the time that I, in fact, did the majority of the intellectual or empirical work on this project. I really believe in giving credit where it's due, particularly when it's for students. And Eli is my former student. I think for like 4 weeks he's been a postdoc because he transitioned, got his PhD.
1 week to last week.
1 week. Oh my gosh, I guess time crawls when you're having fun. So really this is kind of his intellectual work, and I'm going to be framing the big picture and walking you through the slides, but I'm going to call upon Eli to actually stand up and illustrate some of them or talk you through some of them. The title of the talk, it takes after the Oscar Wilde quote about, sure, it's easy to resist everything really except that which is tempting. And it's a longitudinal study of domain specificity in self-control funded through this project. So let me start you off with Tiger Woods here, who is, of course, has a mixed reputation, but for most of his professional career was a paragon of self-control. Otherwise, Gatorade wouldn't have put him on the label. But we, of course, know more about Tiger Woods now and how, in certain domains, Tiger Woods actually demonstrated impulsivity. And Tiger Woods, is debated in the press, right, as to whether, in fact, he really was this kind of tough, self-controlled, regulated human being who had, exceptional attentional focus and discipline. And whether, really the real Tiger Woods is one who could be described as someone who is squeaky clean, almost fanatical in self-control, and in fact an exemplar of mental discipline. It was fun because we were able to not only look at PsycInfo articles, but read Sports Illustrated and the Boston Globe for this part of the So it's a nice illustration for a question which has been occupying us in our lab for quite a while, which is, how is it that an individual can appear to be controlled in one situation, for example, work, sports, et cetera, and yet incredibly impulsive in another, and more relevant to the specific character strength of self-control, is it an impulsive behavior which can be highly domain specific, and then if that's true, why? So wherein lies the domain specificity? Like what accounts for it? What can we say about it? Just to give a clarifying definition, I know that much of the Wake Forest faculty are personally interested in self-control as a research topic, but just for clarification, the definition that Eli and I use is something like the ability to regulate all aspects of yourself, so behavior broadly construed to encompass how you're feeling and what you're paying attention to, what you're thinking, in the service of personally valued goals and standards. So we embrace roughly a dual process model, not committing ourselves to any particulars, but we do have this idea that people can be multiply motivated, that they can have an impulse to do something and yet have a goal which conflicts with that impulse. So in that very broad sense, we believe that there can be dual systems at work, processes that favor a long-term valued objective, a globally held important virtue or goal, and then sort of lower-level processes that impel you towards things that are probably not good for you in that sort of global or long-term sense. So an outline of the talk would just be that give you a little bit of theoretical background, and I know we have a mixed audience today, but I wanted to actually walk you through the empirical results from the first wave of data collection. And then talk to you a little bit about conclusions and future directions. And if I have any self-control myself, I'll end a little early because I'm particularly interested in the philosophers in the audience skewering us on our definitions and lack of clarity. And I think that, selfishly, I'd like to actually have that conversation. So going back to the book that, in Walter Mischel's own words, is one of the most often cited and least often read in psychology, Personality and Assessment in 1968, one could argue that the birthplace of the person-situation debate, which doesn't ever seem to die, though every article I read says it should be dead by now, but it lives on. One could argue that that was, set off by Walter Mischel's observation or his claim that behavior was incredibly variable across situations, and that that traits were an illusion, in fact, or at least that's been the inference. Just by way of illustration here, it's the idea that people have stable traits, virtues and other maybe non-moral traits that are consistent over time, that differentiate us from other people. I think what Walter was pointing to is that, wow, people can really vary in their behavior. In some domains, they can look, very different than in other domains. And the traditional treatment, we would argue, aside from Fleeson and his followers, I'd say many personality psychologists sort of treat these deviations as just error. It's like, oh, okay, well, and in fact, mea culpa, that's what most of my research looked like, actually, for the first however many years. Just, we measure self-control, we got lots of different items, lots of different reporters, and just average it all together, and that's trait-level self-control. And if the kid is, more impulsive when they're at school than when they're at home, we'll just average it out. And I'm just interested in whether, in general, this is a self-controlled child or not. But of course, that leaves a lot to be desired, because it's the differences, across time within an individual, which are incredibly meaningful in many ways. So just to emphasize a point that was made over a decade ago by Will and his lab, it's not that in either or. It's not either people differ between each other, and some people are more self-controlled and some people are less self-controlled, or there's a lot of variability within a person. These things actually can both be true. And in fact, it just suggests that we should have at least two ways of approaching the study of a construct like self-control. On the one hand, it's fine to study average behavior, as I had been, as many personality psychologists do. But in supplementing that, we should also try to explain the deviations from average. So if I'm a generally self-controlled assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, let's try to understand when it is that I am more self-controlled than my average and much less self-controlled than my average. So just to give a slightly more updated reference, the caution that we heeded was that if you study each reaction to each situation as an isolated variable, without any kind of framework for doing so, you can imagine there would be incredibly slow progress, because there would be just so many different situational, how many ways could you cut the situation, how many things could you study? And so a more sensible approach would be then to try to understand situations in terms of their psychologically relevant characteristics. So what would be particularly important for something like self-control? That's what Eli and I asked ourselves. We wanted to understand how different situations that an individual might encounter may vary in terms of the psychologically meaningful components that we are interested in, not like every possible dimension, like, oh, it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, it's outdoors, it's indoors, it's in North Carolina, it's in Pennsylvania. So we were interested in the psychologically meaningful characteristics, and we had some hypotheses about those that got us started. And we also, allowed for the sort of a priori possibility, quite sensibly, that, any one situation could have several meaningful psychological characteristics that, that would be relevant. And so essentially what we did was we, followed this approach to understand, what was it that actually explained domain specificity in impulsivity, which we are using as the opposite of self-control. And these are these lovely graphs, which I think Eli should present, because he does it better.
This is generally representing our model of a multi-level model of impulsive behavior. So on one hand, you have the between individual level. And with that, we're predicting these overall levels of impulsive behavior by domain general self-control. And by domain general self-control, I mean things that feed into that, such as working memory or attention, as well as things like strategies. So perhaps psychological distancing or anything that you can kind of apply across domains. So we're kind of saying that maybe Tiger Woods has relatively high domain general self-control. So he's also relatively low on his overall impulsive behavior. But we also have the within individual level. So here we have domain-specific deviation from his mean. And here we can see that he has relatively low impulsive behavior in the work domain, relatively high impulsive behavior in the sex domain. And what we're kind of predicting here is that something like domain-specific temptation. So maybe he's very impulsive, or has strong impulses, or was very tempted when it came to the sex domain. But maybe he wasn't very tempted to, say, procrastinate when it came to, say, the work domain. So we're predicting that domain-specific temptation and domain-specific perceived harm is going to explain this within individual variables.
Yeah, so that, thank you, Eli. So just to reiterate what Eli was saying, the two psychologically meaningful characteristics that kind of popped out to us would be, what are the costs and the benefits of this situation? What are the potential rewards or, alluring aspects? How tempting or enjoyable do I find this thing? And then contrary-wise, how harmful, how much of a violation of my more global goals and values is it? So we thought that, more important than any other dimension that we could think of would be, do you actually have a value or standard which conflicts with the temptation, and do you actually like it, right? And then we had lots of conversations about how Eli doesn't like chocolate, and how, that was perverse and, strange, and we should study it, but that was the general idea. So I think very much motivated by the Wake Forest initiative, we began to think about self-control in ways that actually were more moral. So I think that, as you probably know, self-control is a topic of very popular interest among social psychologists who don't necessarily consider the fact that they might be studying something moral. They're just interested in self-control for its own sake. Is it a resource? Is it not a resource, et cetera? But very much kind of instigated by this character initiative, we went back to, because we had started work on domain specificity and self-control without that moral framework. When applying for this, we actually went back and sort of researched different moral frameworks and thought, why not? Let's look at the 7 deadly sins as the potential domains in which different temptations lie. And so sloth, which in modern times means not getting your work done, procrastinating, et cetera, not exercising, gluttony, either in terms of food or in terms of other substances that make you feel good in the moment, wrath, losing your temper, envy. And I should say that in our initial work, it didn't occur to us, for example, to think about things like envy in any serious way. Greed. Yeah, there is as many popular culture references in this talk as possible. And then also just impulsive financial behavior, not saving, buying things impulsively that you regret, et cetera. Pride, somewhat old-fashioned deadly sin. When I explain to undergraduates that pride is actually a sin, they like look at me quizzically, like, how could it possibly be that you could have too much pride? And then, of course, lust or sex. And I should say that rather than making you sit through screens and screens of exploratory or confirmatory factor analyses, let's just say that when we collected data from samples that I'll describe, that we roughly approximated a 10-factor structure where we find that people who have problems with procrastination also have problems with other work-related behaviors, right? Like not paying attention when they should, et cetera. So there was a cluster of sort of work behaviors that were impulsive, a cluster of exercise behaviors, food behaviors, drug behaviors, et cetera. So that's what the factor analysis statistics told us, is that there are clusters of temptations that seem to go together. People report having problems with one, tend to also report having problems with the other, and they kind of align with 7 deadly sins, but it was more of a 10-factor than a 7-factor structure. So we are only in the first of a 4-wave study. One objective of the study is to extend the work of the lab, which has really mostly focused on children and adolescents, to more fully embrace young adults and older adults. And if in the break you want to know how we figured out how to sample young adults, but more importantly, older adults who we could follow longitudinally through Qualtrics and MTurk, then you can come and see us. But it was a little bit of a little innovation methodologically that Eli solved the problem, because it's always, of course, a hard thing to get people who are not in college to answer your surveys, especially if you want to follow them longitudinally, and he sort of figured out how. So we're happy to share that. In terms of measures, it's all self-report. So the study design is self-report questionnaires that are answered at 4 different times over 2 years. And the domain-specific scale that we are using had 3 different prompts, but all for the same actual items. So, how often do you overeat, which you regret later, how tempted are you? And there were some qualifiers around this. We really tried to get people to understand that what we wanted was how enjoyable or drawn they were to something regardless of how harmful it was. Just how much would you enjoy this if it weren't harmful or not harmful to you? And then how bad do you think it is to engage in this behavior regardless of how much you enjoy it or how tempting it might be? So there's a limitation that I'll anticipate, which is, asking people these questions is not the ideal way to elicit it, but in this study, that's what we did. We also gave a widely used domain general self-control scale. This is from Roy Baumeister and his colleagues, and asks a variety of questions that get at overall mean level of self-control across domains. So the hypotheses were several. One is we just wanted to confirm that there was this factor structure that people who had behaviors or temptations, et cetera, in one domain would also have the same reported behaviors or temptations in the same domain. And the 10-factor structure I described to you before was what came out. We also wanted to know whether the domain-specific subscales would converge with this Baumeister domain general scale, which we expected. If you actually have problems with eating too much or not exercising enough, we expected that to have some correlation with your general assessment of your self-control. We expected that there would be some criterion-related, we wanted to say predictive validity, but we kind of thought that's a little bit of sleight of hand. It's a cross-sectional study. But the general idea here is that if you had a reported behavior problem in one of these domains, we would expect something like an outcome variable related to that to be correlated. So for example, if you say that you have problems overeating, we expected you to be overweight if we asked you for your height and weight and calculated your BMI. And so here are the correlations just between the subscale scores of the behavior in the work domain, exercise, et cetera. And on average, these were correlated about 0.3, which is just about what Walter Mischel found in 1968 and also what we found in our prior work. So it is true that if you find an individual who has a problem with anger, they are on average more likely to have problems in regulating their finances or overeating, et cetera. But the correlation itself is well, Walter would say it's modest, and other people would say it's substantial, but it is what it is. It's a moderate correlation. It's about 0.3. And the subscales correlated with the Baumeister domain general scale at about negative 0.42. It's negative because these are impulsive behaviors. So the more self-controlled you are, the less likely you are to engage in these impulsive behaviors. And then here on the bottom are the criterion or the outcome variables, so the predictive validity of the scale or the criterion related validity of the scale. So indeed, if you are somebody who reports having frequent lapses in exercise and food-related behaviors, when we calculate your BMI, it turns out that you're actually a little bit overweight. And the other outcomes, also sort of made sense. For example, in the domains of, wrath, envy, greed, and pride, these are the people who are reporting having interpersonal conflicts. And these are all scales that we had taken from other surveys that were developed independently.
Oh, and so just one note, we're only reporting the results from the young adult sample. But part of the reason we're doing that, besides for in the interest of time, is that the results across the cohorts were pretty much identical.
A fourth hypothesis that we addressed even in this first wave of analysis was that the domain-specific variance within individuals, so it's within me, but across the domains in my life, would be greater than the domain general variance between individuals. So just to say that, my hope in a way which is more clear, the idea is that people vary more within themselves across the various domains which they encounter in life than they vary between each other. Right? So this between individual variance, which is what I mostly study, would actually be swamped by the amount of variance which would be within individuals. And this is like, who are these again? It's like Carmen and Wendy. You used to have Calvin and Susie, and that I know because that's my generation. But okay, he replaced the graphic. It's very good. So basically, you know, I think the intuition that a lot of people have is that, you know, some people are more impulsive than others, and they're really, what that means is that, you know, there's very little variability around here. It's like he's always more impulsive than she is, right? So maybe they vary a lot, but, you know, a little bit, but not a lot. And really, what we're finding is that there's a tremendous amount of between individual variance. Like, you know, yes, there's an average impulsivity which is higher for this individual than for this individual, but there's a lot of overlap too by virtue of the fact that there's so much within individual variance. And in what we found in this sample was largely what we have found in other samples, which is that's a 5-to-1 between individuals to within. Sorry, I think I got that. 5-to-1 within to between. So there is 5 times as much variance within an individual than there is between individuals. To reiterate some of the big picture questions, you know, is impulsive behavior domain specific? Can we explain it? You know, our thought was that from the very beginning that temptation and harm, yeah, you're gonna come up, that temptation and harm would be the 2 psychologically meaningful aspects of the situation. And can I just say what my bet was?
Oh, sure. Yeah, well,
so yeah. Yeah, you tell the story because you're so much better. Okay.
So far, we found that, yes, it seems like impulsive behavior is domain specific. So between finding that the confirmatory factor analysis supported our factor structure, it explicitly tested a domain-specific 10-factor structure versus a domain-general 1-factor structure. Domain-specific structure is significantly better. Also, as we just saw, the within individual variance across domains was much, much larger than the between individual variance in overall impulsive behavior. So it does appear that impulsive behavior is domain-specific. So now we want to see if we could explain this domain specificity. So when Angela and I were thinking about this and hypothesizing, we came up with these 2 ideas. That first, well, maybe it's impulse strength, maybe it's temptation. So maybe I'm very impulsive when it comes to food because I'm very tempted to eat the food, whereas I'm not very, I don't procrastinate because I'm not very tempted to procrastinate. Our second hypothesis was, well, maybe it's how bad you think it is to do these things. So how bad it is to procrastinate or how bad it is to overeat, say. So Angela, being the expert in self-control, pretty much called it. She said, I bet you it's temptation.
So to get credit for that, yes.
Yes. I, on the other hand, the neophyte that I was, and also I was introspecting, I was like, well, no, for me, it's, I tend to do things, or I tend to avoid things that are bad for me. So I think it's going to be more the perceived harm. So yeah, I guess I kind of gave it away that Angela was right. We're actually both right. So they're both significant predictors, but as I'll show you that in a second, Angela was more right. So here are our hypotheses testing this model. So we predicted that temptation and perceived harm would explain the within individual variance across domains. Whereas at the between individual level, domain general self-control would explain the between individual variance and overall impulsive behavior. Finally, we also predicted that domain general self-control would moderate the within subject effects of perceived harm and temptation. And that's very jargony or technical, so kind of in English what this means is that individuals with more self-control are less likely to give in to temptation and are more likely to avoid doing things that they think are bad. Another example, Peter Griffin, low self-control tends to give in to temptation. He tends to do things that he's tempted by. So here's a graph of the hierarchical linear model analyses, and we're just showing temptation for now. Actually, there's a lot of things going on in this graph, so I'll explain them. One thing that we can see is on average, so each of the lines are an individual person. Well, we can see that on average, there's a noticeable effect of temptation. But what you can also see is that the between individual level, individuals with higher self-control tend to have lower overall levels of impulsive behavior. So in green, whereas individuals with low self-control tend to have higher levels of overall impulsive behavior. Another thing that's also a little hard to see here is that there's an interaction, such that individuals with low self-control actually tend to have slightly steeper slopes. That is, they tend to do things that they find tempting. Whereas individuals with higher self-control tend to have slightly shallower slopes. They're not as affected by temptation. This is the self-control by perceived harm interaction. Also hard to see. Well, the interaction is easier to see here. but there's actually a slightly negative effect of perceived harm. So in general, people do tend to avoid doing things that they think are harmful. But there is this significant interaction, such that individuals with low self-control actually do tend to do things that they think are harmful. Whereas individuals with higher self-control, they tend to avoid doing things that they think are harmful. So I'd like to bring back to Angela my hypotheses. So, well, first, as predicted, these two things predicted within individual variance across domains in impulsive behavior. So together they explain 60% of the variance. But the thing is, temptation by itself explains 58% of the variance. So perceived harm only explains 2% of the variance. Well, significant though. Yeah. And I would like to make an interesting point that I kind of had an epiphany about, that I think this explains why I had my hypothesis. So I like to think that I'm high in self-control. So I tend to avoid doing things that I think is harmful. But that said, I guess I shouldn't introspect and just kind of use myself to generalize to the population. Empirical data.
Good. All right, and I'm going to quickly run through the gender hypothesis that we had. So in earlier work, I had found that girls are reliably more self-controlled than boys. You find this whether you use a teacher report, a parent report, a self-report, a delay of gratification task. And then I wondered whether, in fact, that you would see this gender difference. Are we superior? Well, are we superior in every way? I think the answer might be right. But are we superior in self-control in adulthood? Our hypothesis is that there would be some tremendous variability across domain, in particular in temptations. And just very quickly, here's what we found. So here's behavior on the left and temptation on the right, and very politically correct. The women are in red, not pink. The men here are in blue. And basically what you find is that impulsive behavior does vary by gender, but it can be really very much explained by temptation. So it's men who actually are doing some stuff over here, the drugs and sex, like Tiger Woods, and they are tempted to do so, much more so than women. Where we are struggling, I would argue, with more trivial things like not getting to the gym, buying too many shoes on Zappos, not getting our work done, and eating too many Oreos. So you can be the judge about whether, who's doing the more severe stuff. But you can understand then, gender differences in impulsive behavior. You can explain it, at least statistically, by differences in temptation. We don't actually find this pattern in school-age children. Just parenthetically, I should say that when you ask kids, how are you feeling right now while they're doing schoolwork, whether you're a girl or a boy, you don't like it. So they're all tempted to do things other than their work, but girls throughout development, do it anyway, essentially. So I think there's a different story to be told in childhood versus adulthood in terms of self-control and gender. So to summarize, we do find evidence for both domain generality and, more novelly, domain specificity in impulsive behavior. In just the first wave of this study, I'm right. And then in terms of implications, this approach to really look within individuals has informed my understanding of personality. I think I just started off not even thinking about within individual differences, and it's really been enlightening for me. And it suggests the importance of temptation in driving behavior and opens up the vista of interventions, which actually might operate not by changing someone's domain general strategies or their executive function, et cetera, but actually changing the temptation strength itself. Paul Rosen at Penn tells me that vegetarians who stay vegetarian eventually actually associate really kind of vulgar or revolting images and associations with meat. And so they're really not tempted to eat it. It's not that they're exerting tremendous self-control at every Thanksgiving dinner. In terms of future directions, we're going to be collecting informant reports and objective outcomes on at least the younger kids in the sample. We're extending this longitudinally to look at stability across time of these domain-specific tendencies. We want to test causal inference much better than you can in a cross-sectional study for the outcomes that we mentioned, and trace developmental trajectories over time. In particular, we're wondering whether kids actually are much simpler than adults in terms of they may not be tempted by as many things, and they may not find as many things harmful, and explore gender differences in these trajectories as well. We're very open to alternative designs in the next year. Would love to explore objective measures of temptation or non-self-report, how tempted are you measures of temptation. So I will leave you here with just this slide, which I, when I was giving a talk to school-age children, forgot to take out of my talk. That was good. I had to do a lot of fancy speaking, and then here's the quote from Oscar Wilde. Thanks very much.
Questions? Over here.
Philosopher here to skewer.
Yes.
Probably not
you again.
Yeah, from the RIT initiative.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, not to skewer, but I just would like some clarification. When you began your talk, you described it, or you described the dynamics of the motivations in terms of the dual process theories, in terms of having a long-term objective or goal that was valued, and then having a lower-level system produce an impulse. Now, here's what I'm thinking. I'm wondering if this explains the entire landscape of data that you presented. So, I mean, when I think of an impulse, I think, I want to do this. Okay, I'll do this. But then I think of habit. I always do this, or I never do this. So in terms of exercise, for example, I am tempted not to exercise, but I don't impulsively not exercise. I never exercise. So it's kind of like I've gotten myself into a bad habit, and somehow I have to get myself into a good one. And then the third thing that I'm thinking about is compulsion. And so impulse is I want to do this, habit I always or never do this, and compulsion is I must do this. So I must buy the 10th pair of shoes. It isn't that I want to buy. I mean, I do maybe, but maybe I don't. But I'm compelled. So I wonder if how those sorts of distinctions play into your analysis, because I mean you did a wonderful job of domain specificity in terms of the 7 different sins. But then when you mentioned exercise, of course, and overeating and shopping, I mean my strong suits. Well, I'm there, in terms of these motives. So I'm wondering how you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that there may be 3 kinds of wants or 3 kinds of impulses. I want to do it.
Well, there's impulse, habit.
I usually don't do it. And then the third thing is I feel compelled to do it. Just to
all of which can sort of line up with temptation in a certain way.
Right,
Maybe compulsion, not so much, but my habit, I never do this, right? So I'm tempted not to exercise again today. I'm thinking I should go to the swimming pool. And I'm tempted not, I never go. So that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's not one that we've wrestled with directly. I wonder whether the differences which sound different, right, like wanting to do something, not having the habit of doing it, feeling compelled to, whether, like how different they really are is one question. And I don't know, my thought is that for many of these impulses, they're pretty nonverbal, which is why I don't like eliciting them by asking you how tempting and enjoyable do you think this is, because you just have a feeling, right, like an approach tendency. So I don't know whether that approach tendency is different if I phrase it as,
do you use avoidance tendencies also? So would there be an approach tendency and avoidance tendency to exercise, for example?
In the study that we conducted, we listed the impulsive behavior itself, and so we didn't, phrase it both, in terms of like how much do you want to exercise, how much do you not want to exercise. So those are all violations, so they're all impulsive.
So I'm just a very brief follow-up. Then this is a thought occurred to me when you spoke about shopping.
Yeah.
I mean, there comes a point at which impulsive shopping becomes compulsive shopping. Right, and I think there is a difference
between number 1 and number 3 in your
exactly in the taxonomy, right? In the taxonomy.
And what's the difference to you? I mean, I'm not sure
Well, the difference to me is that I can go to a store and I can see something I like and I can just impulsively buy it, but I don't have to buy it, right?
Right.
And so, and I find that if I experience that impulse to buy something, if I just leave the store, I won't come back and buy it, right? So I don't have to.
And it feels to you as a difference in kind and not a difference in degree.
Yeah.
It's not just I very much want to buy it, but there's something very
that
different.
kind degree thing is really tricky. But I'm wondering if you're doing longitudinal studies, if you're subjects, then if you find that there have been impulsive patterns that develop, at what point do you label those compulsive? right? That impulse is bled over into a compulsion or somehow become a compulsion.
Probably as an empirical psychologist, there'd probably be no point at which we would say, well, they're over the 6 on the 1 to 7 scale. It's now compulsive. But I would just point to this, and it's something that we've been wrestling with. So Kent Berridge, as you may know, because I know some philosophers are familiar with his work, has shown, at least in rats, and I'm not sure this replicates in people, that you can distinguish between wanting something and liking it. And I think that gets a little bit at your compulsion versus enjoying dimension. So whereas this difference can be neuroanatomically distinguished in rats and elicited behaviorally and measured differently in rats, apparently it's actually very hard to find something that people compulsively do but say they don't like doing in people. So whether that actually is a distinction which is generalizable to other mammals is unclear. But I think what you're speaking about gets at it. So it's a good question. Frankly, we haven't done any work on it other than to muddle over it.
Laura?
I'm thinking you might have some data to answer a question I've been having for about 6 months since we heard Will Hoffman come and give a talk on some of his data. He presented some data that he collected from an experience sampling study showing that people who score high in trait self-control report experiencing fewer daily temptations. And the implication they drew from that is that people high in traits and self-control have this strategy of avoiding tempting things. Whereas the alternative could just be that they were blessed with few impulses, which is why they get to have this successful moral trait. You actually force them to answer questions about every possible temptation. Is there a main effect? Do people who are high in trait self-control feel less temptation when you present them with the 7 deadly sins?
So I think there is a negative correlation between, in fact, no, there is a negative correlation.
Do we know the sizes? I can remember we looked at that.
I don't know, my guess is around 0.3-ish, 0.4.
So they may actually go through life with an easier time because they're not necessarily faced with as strong impulses as the rest of us have to deal with?
I mean, so maybe, right? So I can think of a story where it's not that they just have like less impulses, but actually like self-control somehow helps them avoid the impulses in the first place.
Right, they don't have to necessarily, so that, there's 2 versions of the story. Either they're like my husband who has no vices whatsoever, like no impulses to do anything bad ever, that's not true, or that they, he has all these vices and then he kind of avoids them. Or another story, which is dynamic, which is like a really self-controlled person somehow over time is able to interact with the world. And so they started out having impulses like everyone else, but somehow over time was able to interact in ways, say you repeatedly expose yourself to the temptation and don't indulge, and that, eventually habituates you to it. So there are lots of stories. Partial answer.
Jeff?
So I'm wondering a little bit about the perceived harm variable, and in particular the wording of the question there, in terms of how bad would it be to do X.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering if that might slightly underplay the role of harm, because some people could interpret that in terms of moral badness.
Right. Well, we also said how harmful would it be. So there was a little paragraph. It's like how bad would it be? How harmful would it be? But I think your point is that, yeah, we did use the word harmful in that. Right. Yeah, but I take your point, right? Because otherwise, it's not morally bad to drink Diet Coke. At least I don't think so.
The back over there.
To follow on the first question, I wonder if it might be helpful to distinguish between sins of omission and sins of commission, and that may get into some of those things.
Yeah, you mean to the first point about wanting to do something versus not. Yeah. And by the way, we looked for a factor structure because I thought it would be such a great psych science paper to call it willpower versus won't power. Sometimes you chase the title, but we don't find a factor structure which is very neatly, sins of omission versus commission. I'll just say that, maybe it's there.
Right, because something like exercise, you actually have to actively exercise,
Right.
But then those types of behaviors don't necessarily correlate.
With like procrastination, which you have to do your work. Yeah, so.
And then the wording that you said you weren't too sure about the tempted wording, I do wonder how people interpreted that. Because
so there was
I think some might interpret it as something that I struggle with.
Yeah.
As opposed to something I would like to do.
The word temptation itself has all these conflated, baggage. So I think that if we had just said, how tempted are you, that would be problematic. I think what we did is still problematic, but I'll just say what we tried to do. So how much do you like or enjoy doing this, regardless of how harmful it is? I mean, there's just like these phrases that we were trying to isolate verbally what we wanted, which was the impulse strength. And that's why we are, we're all skeptical about these, implicit measures, but we are willing to try them to see whether we can elicit temptation strength in ways that are not kind of self-report.
Some kind of approach avoidance thing might.
Yeah, joystick, I don't know. Sometimes those things don't really correlate with anything in life. That's a little problematic, but but we're willing to try. We're actually thinking about doing that this fall.
And then, sorry, if I can have a last one, which was, you're looking at sex differences. I mean, that surprised me because you were just talking about how much within subject variance there was compared to between subject variance. I wonder if you've looked at how much between sex variance you have as opposed to within sex variance.
Oh, right. So between versus within sex variant. It's more within than it is between. I think that women are different from each other more than they are different from men on average. Right. But there is and then I guess what we focused on here was the domain specificity. I should also say that in terms of domain general self-control, we don't find any differences between genders.
So now that I think about it kind of statistically, like what an ANOVA, like an F-test or ANOVA does, is it compares like the within group variance to the between group variance. So kind of like whatever domains as you saw were significant, that suggests that between group variance was kind of bigger than the within group variance.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's it. So we kind of forgot to mention though. We did look at overall domain general self-control, as well as the overall impulsive behavior between genders.
And that's where you find no gender. Yeah, there are no gender. There are no significant differences in the large sector.
Up front. One thing that comes to mind with the example of Tiger Woods is here's another way of explaining what's going on. Yeah. He is obsessive compulsive, and in the domain of work, he is very successfully obsessive compulsive. Mm-hmm. And in the domain of sex, he is.
You mean he has a really strong impulse to work out and to practice? Is that the way you're using obsessive compulsive? I think obsessive compulsive means something very specific in the clinical literature, like you have an obsession and then
you could understand it in a very broad way.
Okay, yeah, but like in the vernacular sense, like he's obsessive.
He's very obsessive. When he's at work, he is at work and working very intensely, very single-mindedly. And when he's out to play, he's
yeah, although, I mean, if you believe him or others who have been in similar situations, the difference might be, or I'm not sure if I have everything in your head right, that the things that he did that got him on the cover of Us magazine were regrettable, like maybe even in the moment, like he knew he shouldn't have been doing them, but he was doing. Whereas if you're obsessively working out and preparing for your tournament, there isn't that same hue of like immediate, like I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. I don't know whether if he's going to the gym and that's maybe not the story you're telling me, but it does seem to me that there could be something very different about obsessively doing one thing which is aligned with his long-term goals and another which is directly in opposition to his long-term goals.
So that it wouldn't involve the sort of dual process, let's say, model that you were.
I think that when he is obsessively working out, there is not a conflict between the, I'm doing this right now and I feel like doing it and I want to be doing it. My guess is that since you have to work out a lot for that. But, so I assume that there's not a conflict there. Could be.
Rhonda?
How do you settle on the 7 deadly sins as the moral taxonomy you're going to use?
Oh, as opposed to another taxonomy?
Yeah.
I think I was thinking about psych science again, to be totally honest. I mean, we did sort of go through various, other like Benjamin Franklin's, list of virtues, and we thought a little bit about the VIA, the 24 strengths from Marty Seligman, my advisor, and yours as well. But I think maybe for this one, we actually had a question for Jeff at his presentation that I didn't have a chance to ask, which is, why didn't you use the full set of the 24 strengths? And I noticed as you were presenting your results that humor, for example, is something that most people actually don't think is something moral. Of course, that's in the 24 strengths. So we thought that the 24 strengths were too broad, that they weren't actually all vices in the sense that we wanted them to be. Did we do anything else, Eli? I don't know. I think that was mostly it.
So when we initially kind of started these studies, we thought, hey, look, like, do these things map onto the 7 deadly sins? And it mostly did, except for a few things like envy or pride. So I guess when it came time to actually like study moral character, this was the 7 deadly sins was not like a natural fit. We're like, well, we'll just add.
Do you have another taxonomy you want to lobby for?
Not really. I mean, earlier today we were talking about, affirmative stuff and Hype's model, so, there are a few established.
Well, one thing we should probably do just after this, or during or after this meeting, is just look at some of the alternatives and see what's maybe missing.
Right. See what the overlap is.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
You can take one more quick question.
Mine just builds on that, but with the data you have, I mean, you have the factor structure that shows 10 factors, but presumably there are interrelationships between those factors that might be able to tell you that there's certain subfactors or certain patterns that make some more similar to the other, that would say the key components of the immoral domain are these things, and that might start to help you figure out what are the key components of immoral situations, and that could tell you if you're missing something like of those other 24 or whatever model.
I mean, one way of doing that, but maybe not the only one, is to look for a hierarchy. Like, so they're the 10, but do the 10 then organize themselves into, you know, and at least on our first pass at it, we're not seeing a hierarchy that makes sense to us, but we're going to pursue that. It's a good idea.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much.